May I request everyone to please be seated? जी दो जी मैं बस वेट कर रहा हूँ ये लोग बैठ जाएं। हम शुरू करने वाले हैं, अगर आप अपनी सीटों पे बैठ जाएं। उठा ही नहीं रहे लोगों को। I welcome you to this panel, this very important panel on the situation in Palestine. My name is Yaqoob Bangash. I am the CEO of ThinkFest, one of the partners of the Indus Conclave. And I'm very happy to be introducing this panel and topic today, which is a very important and topical one with things happening literally by the minute in it. This panel is going to be around the newly finished book of Professor Mehran Kamrava. Professor Mehran Kamrava is Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. His research focuses on the modern political history and contemporary issues of the Middle East. He has authored many books. His latest one is, of course, the title of this panel, The Impossibility of Palestine, and it is on the history, geography, and culture of Palestine. He is also an expert on Iran. His book, published last year, was called How Islam Rules Iran, Theology and Theocracy in the Islamic Republic. He has published several books on Iran and Middle East and a number of other disciplines. So we are very happy to welcome him back. Professor Mehran was a speaker at the ThinkFest in 2024. So we are very happy that after about a year and a half, we are able to welcome him back to Pakistan through this collaboration with the Indus Conclave. Professor Mehran, I request you to please join us on stage. In conversation with Professor Mehran Kamrava will be my dear friend, a very eminent lawyer, a commentator, writes for the newspapers also, and has been on TV on several programs, has actually run a TV program, Asad Rahim Khan. Thank you so much, Asad. Before I hand over to Asad to continue the program, let me just say a couple of things about the topic. And I love that Professor Mehran's book is actually called The Impossibility of Palestine, because that is really what it is. Just in terms of its idea, in terms of its reality and what's happening there. A lot of people, especially in the Western world, have only become aware of the Palestinian issue after October 7, 2023, but it's been an issue before that in '67, before that in 1948, and even before that for hundreds of years And in fact, I would say going back to thousands of years, Palestine and the issue of the Palestinians is not just a recent construct and is not a recent issue. Another thing which I really do want to underline is that one needs to understand that the Palestine issue is very much a national issue. A lot of the times people kind of say, oh, it's only a Muslim issue. They are about 15–20% of Palestinians who are actually Christian. Sadly, most of them are now outside of Palestine, but a lot of the leading intellectuals of Palestinian nationalism have actually not been Muslim. So it is a question of national liberation also, and I think that must not be forgotten. And lastly, I think, and here Professor Mehran's expertise actually, will really be helpful in helping us understand the context of Palestine within the greater Middle East. Because another big lack of understanding that we have here in Pakistan is how do other Middle Eastern countries, both Arab and non-Arab, kind of understand the Palestinian issue and relate to it. And I hope all of you know that just a few days ago, there was a peace proposal by President Trump. Just a few hours ago, about 10–12 hours ago, Hamas kind of accepted it in a way. So things are developing literally by the hour. So this is a very topical issue, and we are so happy that one of the foremost experts on this in the world, Professor Mehran Kamrava, is here to speak to us about it. And there will be time for questions. So please do listen intently and do ask questions towards the end of it. Over to you, Asad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yaqoob Bangash साहब. सबसे गुजारिश करेंगे कि ज़रा आप अगर सब बैठ जाएं और थोड़ा सा अगर शोर कम हो जाए कि जो प्रोफेसर साहब हैं उनकी भी बात हम सुन सकें. ये यहाँ से प्लीज़ थोड़ा सा ज़रा आप कम कर दें, वरना किसी को आवाज़ नहीं आएगी. कोशिश हमारी होगी कि जितने ज़्यादा सवाल पूछे जा सकें उतना ही बेहतर है. From over here also, I am grateful. Thank you. So we are particularly privileged for a number of reasons to have Professor Mehran with us today. I think every man and woman in this room bears witness to genocide. And there's very little space, perhaps, to disagree with that. So what is happening in Palestine has become the most pressing moral question of our time. And the rage and indignation and helplessness that Muslim majority nations feel has been met with, at least at the level of their governments, most governments, with impotence and sometimes complicity. So obviously, when some things have such an emotional base, someone like Professor Mehran is extremely valuable to be able to lend a structure to those affinities. Before we get into this, though, we're once again now hearing and reading about a Palestinian plan, about state solutions, and what I think, Professor, you also mentioned, what Edward Said referred to as the question of Palestine. So Professor Mehran has, in his own way, answered that question, saying that while the Palestinian nation is as strong as ever and endures, the idea of statehood, the concept of statehood, is becoming more and more difficult. And he comes to this conclusion through extensive study and field work. So Professor, if I could ask you to please set the stage for us. You have said in your 2016 book, The Impossibility of Palestine, that the Zionist entity has gone from a policy of conquest to occupation to separation within that occupation. What have the events of 7th October and the genocide that has ensued done to maybe change anything about the situation as you saw it and then wrote about it in your book?
Thank you very much for that question. First, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the organizers of the Indus Conclave. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Pakistan, a country with a very rich intellectual heritage, and particularly a city like Lahore that has been the epicenter of culture and intellectual production. So it's a privilege and an honor being back here. As you mentioned, in a couple of days, we will be coming up on the second anniversary of a genocide that's been happening before our eyes. Some 64,000 people have now been killed, murdered in cold blood. And the genocide has been part of a broader, longer, tragic history of how Israel has been trying to quote-unquote deal with the Palestinian problem, with what it perceives to be a Palestinian problem. So although the genocide itself, the mass killing and ethnic cleansing, militarily and physically, of Palestinians is 2 years old, the process of getting rid of Palestinians for Israel is an older process. It actually dates back to the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, we had a brief window where we could kind of see a two-state solution. But through a process of systematic cleansing of Palestinians, getting rid of the Palestinians, unfortunately, Israel has rendered a Palestinian state improbable, not feasible. I first went to Palestine in 1993, and as a student of the Middle East, as a professor of Middle Eastern studies, I wanted to see the place for myself. Yes. And it occurred to me that Palestine in itself had certain characteristics that made it difficult for a Palestinian state to be established. But much more importantly, I discovered that Israel had certain policies that made the Palestinian state all the more improbable. And through time, throughout the 1990s, with a Palestinian Authority that unintentionally became complicit with Israeli authorities, and then through Israel's systematic policies throughout the 2000s, with the placement very strategically of settlements in Israel, in Palestinian territories, we see that Palestine as a country, as an entity, as a physical national entity, becomes increasingly impossible. And so in the mid-2000s, I decided to really study this. And this was a book, unlike most other ones, that I wrote from the heart, because it was not an easy book for me to write. It was not an easy set of conclusions for me to write, to come to. And I discovered that while a so-called two-state solution is a great abstract idea for many liberal-hearted Westerners, yes, many diplomats, if they consider themselves enlightened, talk about a Palestinian state. In reality, a Palestinian state as a territory with a flag, United Nations representation, as an entity that can provide and perform the basic functions of a state, defend its people, have sovereignty, represent its people, that is impossible. And so this was an extremely difficult reality to come to. Very quickly, I will just say that Israel has tried different ways of dealing with the Palestinians, getting rid of Palestinians as a people, as a country, as a state, and as a nation. And one of the first things it did was that by the 1990s, of course, there were other previous attempts, but what it tried to do is what one Palestinian told me is to create human containers.
Yes.
These human containers would be West Bank and Gaza and contain Palestinians in these cages, national cages, one in Gaza, one in, and contain them in there, and exercise an apartheid whereby the Palestinians would be kept separately, treated separately. And in the process, there was a legal ethnic cleansing that was going on, whereby Palestinians found it increasingly legally difficult to exercise their humanity. And so, for example, if you lived in East Jerusalem, you couldn't marry a Palestinian from the West Bank and still continue to be married and live in East Jerusalem. You had to go. And if you wanted to, for example, renew your residency in East Jerusalem, you had to provide your water or electricity bill for the last 5 years. I don't know how many of us keep our electricity bills for the last 5 years. So there were various legal mechanisms that Israel introduced to get rid of these Palestinians as much as possible. And then what we have is, unfortunately, Palestinian economic and political elites that became inadvertently complicit in the act of occupation. So the PLO and the Palestine National Authority, in order to be able to maintain power, had no option but to deal with with the Israeli authorities. And they became unintentional partners in the act of occupation. And then unintentionally, unfortunately, Palestinian civil society organizations themselves became instruments of occupation. Because Palestinian civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, they needed funding. And they would get funding from the World Bank or from the European Union. And to get that funding, they had to prove somehow that they were not complicit in acts of terrorism, and that they would cooperate with either the occupation authority or with the Palestinian Authority. So we had this unintentional proliferation of NGOs that had to prove that they were well behaving in a European standard, which meant that acts of resistance, civil resistance, were at the societal level, were suppressed. And so there were mechanisms, not just as a result of what Israel was doing, but its unintended ripple effects in Palestinian governance and Palestinian civil society organizations that further rendered Palestinian state unlikely. I just want to add one element of complexity here, which you mentioned. Now, a Palestinian state as a sovereign, independent entity capable of having airports, capable of having UN representation, capable of providing national defense, capable of collecting garbage, paying salaries, that might be untenable, impossible, because of what's been happening. But identity is something quite different. And the very fact that Israel and that Palestinians who have been complicit with Israeli authorities have been trying to suppress and make impossible a Palestinian state does not mean that Palestinian national identity is suppressed. In fact, because of the impossibility of a Palestinian state, Palestinian national identity, Palestinian heritage and culture, Palestinian oral tradition and intellectual production. All of those are quite robust. Palestinian national symbols, Palestinian stories and lores, the stories, that identity that constitutes what it means to be Palestinian, continues to not only persevere, but perpetuate and in fact thrive as a result of this. And it was really interesting, just by way of conclusion, in terms of moving forward, as I was going around and talking to Palestinians and asking them how they see the future, there was a Palestinian activist who said something that really stuck in my head. He said, look, I tell the Israelis, okay, you took my land, you banned my flag, you took my home, you took everything I had, now give me health care. So what is interesting is that at least among a young generation of Palestinians, the definition of liberation is quite different. My generation used to define liberation in military territorial terms. Now, liberation is being seen by an increasing number of Palestinians in terms of human dignity, in terms of quality of life, in terms of the ability to go about your daily life without being harassed by Israeli occupation forces, without being harassed by Israeli soldiers at the local checkpoint. And I think looking into the horizon, probably not in my lifetime, but looking into the horizon, obviously Israel has not been able to get rid of Palestine. Israel has not been able to get rid of what it means to be Palestinian. Palestinian national identity continues to thrive. And Israel's various solutions, whether it has been legal cleansing or actual physical cleansing that we've been bearing witness for the last 2 years, none of these have worked. And so looking into the horizon, most likely we're looking at a new entity whereby Palestinians will have to be given their full human rights to be able to live in dignity.
Professor, thank you for such a poignant and wide-ranging answer. You mentioned at the beginning of your book that these were conclusions that you hope to be proven wrong on. And it's a very unsparing look. Many of those conclusions you've touched on right now. If we look at the numbers, which you've very helpfully broken down, 78% of historical Palestine is now Israel proper. So the remaining 22% are now increasingly small strips of land on the Jordan River and on the Egyptian border. You likened it, and this is a metaphor that has been used elsewhere also, and it's a very difficult metaphor to take in, to the West Bank being turned into a Swiss cheese sort of format, which is that it is being made non-contiguous. Non-contiguous as in neither Gaza nor the West Bank are joined together, and now within the West Bank it is becoming increasingly difficult to have a territorially cohesive, unit of land. Interestingly, so much Western literature goes in the other direction vis-a-vis 1993. You have said that the turning point in contemporary political history of Palestine is the Oslo Accords, which you quoted Edward Said. He said this was a Palestinian Versailles.
Exactly.
Whereas the other perspective was that this is a miracle for Zionism. And you have agreed with these two conclusions. So given that this was so celebrated in the West, as the closest the Israelis and the Palestinians have come to shaking hands, why would you say this was the turning point and this is where, you developed a new normal? And I'd ask जी कि पीछे please ज़रा खामोश हो जाएं, ये जो इधर लाइन है हमें आवाज़ नहीं आ रही, इधर पीछे और उस कोने में. Thank you.
So in order for Yasser Arafat to retain power, he agreed to the division of the West Bank into 3 chunks, 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. And Area A became under full Palestinian control, Area C under full Israeli control, and Area B under joint control, which meant that Palestinians would administer the areas, but Israelis would ensure to its security, meaning that they wouldn't oppose Israel. And so effectively, Palestinian Authority became the municipal authority of the mayor of a couple of Palestinian cities. And in the meanwhile, the Israelis expanded settlements. And these settlements were strategically placed around the West Bank and inside the West Bank to ensure that the West Bank is not contiguous and that it is surrounded by Israeli populations.
Yes.
So effectively, you had population transfer. In the meanwhile, Israel erected a wall that includes 10% of the territory of the West Bank, the so-called security barrier.
Yes.
And what the wall did and what it has done, it divided many Palestinian villages. So you can't go from one part of the village to the other. So previously, in the early 1990s, whereby you could go, for example, from Bethlehem to either Jerusalem or to Ramallah in, let's say, an hour, now it takes 4.5 hours, and multiple Israeli checkpoints. And what was one straight road before now is a zigzag road full of Israeli checkpoints. So the people who talk about the two-state solution or a Palestinian state have never been there. They are not familiar with conditions on the ground, with the strategic placement of these Israeli settlements, and the reality of life for Palestinians. And so we can talk about Palestinian liberation all we want, but what the Oslo Accord did was to facilitate this division of Palestine, of historic Palestine, not just of Greater Palestine, but of the West Bank into these areas.
Thank you. And you mentioned a solution. And you said that statehood, while it always has a territorial reference, is also many things beyond that. Towards the end of your book, while completely comprehensively critiquing this two-state format, there are some alternatives. One being a one-state solution. Now, you've also prefaced this by saying that Israel is very systematically deprecating both the two-state and the one-state. But given the idea of forgetting a sort of demarcation, would that be in a complete sort of fantastic alternate universe? Because you've written about how strong those feelings of hatred are on the ground, and the demographic anxiety for the Zionist idea that if we already have zero tolerance for these people on our territory, at least that 78%, we don't want to reverse a trend that we've been working on, or at least revisionist and religious Zionism has been working on for so long.
Exactly. And all of this is before the genocide.
Yes.
So any of us who have lost a loved one knows that the pain lingers for decades of losing a loved one. And if you think of someone else as responsible for the murder of your loved one, you're unlikely to forgive that person, forget and forgive for your entire lifetime. The wounds are far too deep. But in many ways, by their very action, the Israeli right in general and Netanyahu in particular have rendered the idea of Israel as it exists today untenable. Yes, we do talk about the impossibility of Palestine, but Israel cannot keep this up indefinitely either. It cannot eradicate millions of Palestinians. There will not always be an empowering Donald Trump in the United States. The international community, the European Union, particularly a country like Germany, cannot indefinitely pretend that Palestinians are subhuman and it doesn't care about their plight, it doesn't care about their murder. So at some point, even Europe has to wake up to the crime that it is complicit in enabling Israel to commit. And so I don't think what we see as Israel today can thrive and succeed. Looking down the line, again, it won't be probably in my lifetime, but in the same way that, for example, in the 1950s, we never thought South Africa would change. In the same way that we never thought South Africa would change. Or in 1933 or 34, we never thought Nazism would come to an end. I think it is quite conceivable that today this version of Zionism that is manifest today won't last.
And on that same note, do you see that the needle is moving in that direction, given that 2-3 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu goes to the United Nations, there's very many member states there, and things are treated as business as usual. 3 years later, since the genocide as well, you had a complete walkout. You have a case of genocide pending against Israel in the International Court of Justice, by South Africa, in fact, in quite an arc of historic redemption. You see arrest warrants being issued against the Israeli leadership by the ICC. Is something happening? And more importantly, the youth demographic, at least younger people in the United States. So as Israel's major patron, the fact that they're losing such a large and, well, imminently influential segment of the population, that has disturbed a lot of bureaucrats in Tel Aviv, at least. What's your perspective?
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. There is no doubt that there's a tragedy of unfathomable proportions happening right now in Gaza and also in the West Bank. This genocide is tragic and unprecedented, at least in our lifetime. But if there's any silver lining, it is the fact that by their very murderous acts, people like Netanyahu and Trump have made entirely new generations of global citizens aware of the plight of Palestinians. And they have rendered the current manifestation of Zionism untenable in the long run. So as you mentioned, now people who previously didn't care or didn't know anything about history or couldn't point to Palestine on a map, now they talk about the necessity of ending the genocide. And so certainly the needle is moving, not just by leaders, but much more importantly, by future generations of politically aware global citizens. It's the young that make our future, and their awareness is what gives me hope.
So given that the contours of conversation are now changing, I think one extremely compelling observation you had, and I think that's how we need to reframe this conversation. You said no one talks about 1948 anymore. We have automatically started as our principal position 1967 and onwards, even though the ethnic cleansing, the fact of conquest happened at its most brutal in 1948 and around that time. Is there a way that we can somehow jog back to that starting point, or are we just in a post-1967 universe? And this being the occupation to the extent of Gaza and the West Bank, as opposed to all of historical Palestine, which is the vast majority of the country.
That's exactly the point. As was earlier mentioned, I live in Qatar.
Yes.
And Doha, unlike Lahore, is a very small state. And because of my job, I interact with a lot of ambassadors, many of them from Europe. And I always tell them, why is your historical memory so selective that you start with 1967?
Yes.
Why not go back to 1948 or before that? And so why is it that we keep talking about occupied territories but not Palestine? And the murder, the killing of Palestine, the death of Palestine as an entity back in 1948. And so what I think is much more likely to happen now that the two-state solution has been rendered improbable and impossible is that we have reverted back to a situation in which within that geographic territory that was historic Palestine, Palestinians and Israelis need to learn to live with one another. Look, regardless of whether we're pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, whether we believe in Palestinian nationalism or in Israeli Zionism, we cannot get rid of Israel as an entity and of Israelis. It's a reality we got to come to grips with. And by the same token, we cannot, or Israelis cannot get rid of Palestinians. They've tried for decades. They've tried multiple ways, and they simply cannot get rid of them. The only solution, therefore, is for Israelis and Palestinians to come to some sort of modus vivendi, to come to some sort of understanding that they just have to share this piece of land together. That may sound heretical for many people to hear. That may sound difficult for many people to accept, but that is the difficult reality that we have to deal with.
And then circling back to your previous point, that will also demand fundamental realignments within the Zionist project. Because right now, that status quo is untenable, surely.
Absolutely. But I teach Middle East politics, and one of the things that I keep telling my students is that as a national ideology, Zionism from its inception in the late 1800s to 2025 has gone through profound transformations. So in the last 150, 180 years, it's gone through profound transformations, and there's no reason to believe that in the next 150 years, it will not continue to go through profound transformations.
And if we can shift that lens now to the Palestinian leadership. You've mentioned that a lack of, actual people leading from the front greatly disadvantaged the Palestinian resistance in 1948. And then there came a counter-elite later on and during the Intifada. Right now, with Mahmoud Abbas in charge of the authority, where, as you said, not in direct relation to Mr. Abbas, but you said that, well, the Palestinian leadership has become complicit in terms of its own occupation. Some have gone as far as saying they've become Israeli subcontractors. Where do you see the next sliver of hope from within Palestine? You mentioned, in fact, Palestine's Mandela also as an alternative to both the authority and to Hamas. What would you say?
Absolutely. There are Palestinian Mandelas. And I think that is where the hope lies. First of all, let me just elaborate something which I said, elaborate on something that I said earlier. Much of the cement for the security barrier that I mentioned earlier comes from the West Bank.
Right.
And I think that's important to remember. The predominant currency that is used in the West Bank is the shekel, the Israeli currency.
Wow.
The Jordanian dinar is there, but good luck trying to find an ATM machine that will give you the Jordanian dinar. And imagine if you live in Ramallah, where do you get your shampoo from? Where is your soap from? When you go to the local greengrocer, where do you get your basic goods from? Those are all Israelis. Who imports them? These people who are making a profit, the merchants who are making a profit. Who runs the Palestinian cell phone network? That is, when you're in Ramallah and you turn on your cell phone, Who's benefiting from that? And what is the economic relationship? So we talk about the Oslo Accords that were signed in 1995. What we ignore is the so-called Paris Economic Protocol that was signed the following year, whereby the complicit Palestinian leadership turned Palestinian economy over to Israel just so that it could get an agreement. So Israel collects the tariff for all the goods that used to be imported into and exported out of the West Bank. And then when they feel like it, the Israeli authorities won't release that tariff fund. So I think it's important to remember that yes, Israel is pernicious, it is murderous, but that doesn't absolve many Palestinians themselves who profit from the occupation and who are complicit in these acts of profiteering or benefiting from the status quo. That's one thing to remember. Having said that, there are Palestinians who see through that. I wasn't even an expert on Palestine before I went to the region, and it opened my eyes. I imagine if you're Palestinian and you live in that daily life where you know that the guy next door to you is somebody who's profiting from the occupation.
Yes.
So there are many Palestinians, younger in generation, untainted by the temptations of power and of Palestinian authority, who see through this and who are determined to think outside the box. And I think the central point of the book and the central message that I want to convey to audiences is that our conventional approaches have not worked. They have only resulted in the expansion of Israel militarily, physically, demographically, the further annexation of Palestinian territories, the dismemberment of Palestine as we know it. And therefore, we need new mindset. We need to think outside the box. Our conventional approaches haven't worked. We need to think differently if there is going to be a future.
And in terms of other approaches, and much more violent approaches, there was speculation, especially in this part of the world, as to what led to the 7th October attacks. Now, one theory put forward was that Israel was going towards greater recognition, or at least greater recognition was being extended by Arab and Muslim countries at the behest of the United States. And this was to disrupt that. Do you see this as something of a structural shift? What led to 7th October, which seems to have caught Israel off guard as well?
Yeah, Israel was caught off guard. What resulted in the 7th of October was desperation within Hamas.
I see.
Because after the 2000s, particularly after 2004, 2005, Hamas was in search of a mandate. Is it a resistance group that proactively fights occupation, or is it an administrative apparatus that governs what transpires in Gaza?
Yes.
And there was a debate within Hamas leadership. And those who called for a more proactive posture of resistance won out. And that resulted in October 7th. And so if you kind of look into the Palestinian resistance, you will see that many of the issues that I have mentioned here are debated much more viscerally and much more immediately within Palestinian leadership. What does it mean to resist? What does resistance mean in the context of an overbearing Israeli presence into your everyday life, whereby at night you go into your bedroom and Israeli soldiers with absolutely no harm to them can walk into your bedroom 2, 3 in the morning and arrest you, and not only violate your privacy, but arrest you, pull you out, and drag you into, and you don't know what happens. So within the context of life under those circumstances, what does it mean to resist? And that debate, that discussion resulted in October 7th, whereby Hamas had to prove that it was not just a resistance group, but it was a resistance group that could pull off a spectacular act of resistance against Israel.
And if for a second I could return to your book on statehood, you have mentioned two very interesting places. One is Tibet and the other is Poland. And with regards to Tibet, you say, and these are two different ends of the spectrum, you say that, well, this was a place that was subsumed by China, even though its culture and its symbolism continues to live on. Whereas Poland, by contrast, again, subsumed previously by the Russians, that was able to break out and build its own trajectory. But you've caveated that by saying that the great powers supported Poland's independence and Poland breaking out, whereas we know that the position with Palestine is exactly to the contrary. So on this Tibet to Poland spectrum, where do you see Palestine going, given that the United States continues to have veto power and people like Mike Pence are actually saying, we don't need to be honest brokers, we have to be Zionists?
Thank you for bringing that up, because essentially what we have is a historic process of conquest. So we have a process whereby you have technologically advanced people, European Zionists, go to a place that doesn't have that level of technological advancement.
That's right.
Conquer it and create a country in 1948. And we have a process of conquest. So we can draw lessons from several historical examples. We have a conquest of Europeans in Australia. We have a conquest of the Chinese in Tibet. We have a conquest of Europeans in the Americas. And then we have a conquest of the Europeans of Palestine.
Yes.
And so we can draw lessons. And so as you mentioned, I bring out these two contrasting examples, whereby Poland, if we go back to history, did not exist for 150 years. There was 150 years where Poland disappeared. But in that 150 years, despite the fact that Poland as a country didn't exist, there was an industrial base that maintained Poland. It wasn't a bunch of feudal lords that were eager to sell their land to the conquerors for a profit, which was the case in Palestine. And of course, there were it wasn't just through purchases, there were whispering operations, there was ethnic cleansing beginning in 1947, particularly the massacres in villages of Deir Yassin and elsewhere. But there were also many Palestinian landlords who sold their land at the same time. And so I say that, and what happened in the case of Poland was that there was also an international community that supported and sustained the idea of Polish sovereignty and Polish statehood. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Tibet, where we've had population transfer, we have had conquest of a technologically less advanced population by more advanced people. We have had a fair amount of coercion and force and military power and re-education and all of that. And in my opinion, Palestine falls somewhere in between those two extreme poles, whereby we have a Palestinian population that in the process of occupation has become tremendously highly educated. Today, Palestinians anywhere in the world, members of the Palestinian diaspora, tend to be among the most successful in those adopted countries. And those are the people who have the opportunity, the freedom, the ability to maintain the idea of Palestine as a national entity. In Israel, you can't maintain the idea of Palestine. You're under occupation, multiple different kinds of Israeli and Zionist hegemony that prevents that. And so Palestinians are in some ways fortunate in the fact that the diaspora of Palestine is so erudite, maintains this robust debate and intellectual vibrancy of what it means to be Palestinian, the idea of Palestine, that it does not only, it doesn't die from public discourse, as you mentioned earlier, even the young are talking about it. And now the needle has moved, more and more of us are talking about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. We're going to open it up to the audience for questions. Guzarish hai, if we could keep them as brief as possible so we can get as many people as possible. And with your permission, Professor, we'll go for 3 at a time, if that's all right.
Great conversation. Thanks, Dr. Mehran. So what is the latest on the issue? 8 Muslim countries proposed a draft last week. President Trump modified that draft in favor of Israel. Without checking the 20 points Trump plan, Pakistan Prime Minister supported it. Then we see the backlash. But why Muslim countries are not proposing a revised final draft, and what all must be included in that draft?
और एक माइक उधर दे दें जरा, इधर बीच में. In the beige shirt.
Can I borrow a piece
Of course, of course.
Thank you. I got the pen. Thank you.
Professor, you talked about how Palestinian Authority is complicit in the occupation, but you didn't talk about how the Arab world at large is also complicit in that. So talking about the future of this issue, how do you see the evolution of Arab world? Like, are they going to evolve in the future? Are they taking this issue seriously, unlike what they are doing right now?
और ये तीसरा over here to the gentleman in the blazer. इधर front पे. Thank you.
Professor Kamrava, thank you very, very much for your talk. I wanted to know, you mentioned something about talking about young Palestinians trying to think outside the box in terms of how they live their lives. When I worked in Palestine, one of the issues that a lot of young people I spoke to encountered was that they felt that they could either resist, whether that was economically or even through force of arms, in which case the Israeli authorities could destroy their lives, or they could sort of fit in with the establishment, the PLO, Palestinian Authority mainstream, and thereby become somewhat complicit in the occupation. What are these ideas, practical ideas you would have for young Palestinians to continue resisting without risking their lives in the manner that many have?
Thank you. This is one of the joys of being in a place like this where you get such excellent questions. So first let me thank people who asked the question. Now, the first question about the peace plan and how it was accepted by 20 or some odd leaders of, well, who were the people who accepted those? People who themselves see political Islam as a mortal threat. And I think that's important to remember. One of the important things about the peace plan, that's the latest peace plan that's not mentioned, at least Hamas doesn't mention it, is the provision that Hamas needs to lay down its arms and effectively disband itself. And Hamas's response actually focused on the first part of the plan, which is to turn over to Israel the hostages that it still has and the bodies. It did not talk about the day after and what Hamas would become. Now, if you think of the people who've endorsed the peace plan, the nations, the countries that have endorsed the peace plan, every one of them, almost every one of them, sees political Islam as a mortal threat. And if they endorse political Islam in somehow as a political force in daily life, it's according to their own interpretation, their own narrow, politically shaped interpretation of what Islam's role in public life ought to be. So state leaders are driven by agendas that are not often consistent with the agendas of individuals and their populations. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Second question was about the evolution of the Arab world and their complicity. I live in the Persian Gulf country of Qatar. And although the Qatari government has been front and center in its support for Palestinians, many of the nearby countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, proactively ban expressions of solidarity with Palestinians. And I think that's important to remember. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, have prohibition against wearing the Palestinian kafia, the scarf that is so emblematic of Palestinian identity and Palestinian nationhood. Palestinian flag is banned in places like the UAE. And so I think it's important to remember that rhetoric aside and expressions of solidarity aside, when push comes to shove, many of our own political leaders are either actively or silently complicit in what Israel is doing. And I think that is really important to keep in mind. And the last question is the dilemma that Palestinian youth have of whether to exit from politics or somehow work with the Palestinian Authority and unintentionally become complicit. I think you're absolutely right. There's this, for those of us who've been to Palestine, there's this Palestinian notion called sumud, which means resistance. Incidentally, it's the name of this flotilla that just was broken up by the Israelis. It was called the Sumud flotilla. Sumud means resistance, not just in terms of going and blowing up things or actively, but resistance in terms of daily life. Resistance in terms of staying put and not letting difficult daily conditions make you leave Palestine, staying put, staying in the territory. So those who actually live in the territory are in a much better position to come up with practical solutions on how to live their daily life. But Palestinians themselves are aware of this notion of resistance as a routine aspect of daily life. Again, not in military or political terms, but much more so life. Again, not in military or political terms, but much more so in terms of routine cultural ways of living your life in a way that resists Israeli authority.
Thank you, Professor. We'll take another round of questions. एक यहाँ दे दें, ज़रा इधर.
Professor Mehran, is there any other bone of contention between Palestine and Israel except grabbing of land on the cost of genocide? I think Israel has become stigma of slur on the face of civilization. If we think that he will damage Islam, Islam is not a piece of a land. He is the idea which lives in the hearts of 55 countries, Muslim countries. Thank you.
I would ask the gents and ladies in the back, zara idhar please thoda sa kam kar dein, awaaz nahi aa rahi hai idhar tak.
My mic or his?
No, it's mine. All mine.
Professor, thanks a lot firstly for this elaborative discussion. There is something that I want to ask about the role of Iran and the axis of resistance in this whole landscape of Palestinian conflict or this genocide that has reinvigorated itself in October 2023.
We'll take another question. We'll go over there. Idhar.
Hello, sir. My name is Arif Javed, and I'm from University of Central Punjab Law Faculty. Sir, you mentioned that the best solution for the Palestine-Israel conflict is two states. Sir, I wanted to ask that Israel has already taken 78% of the land and 22% is remaining, which is called Gaza Strip right now. Sir, don't you think that it will be victory for the Israel and surrender of the Palestine that they have taken 78% land by genocide, and now they have to surrender that you have taken this by genocide and we are outnumbered against you, we cannot do anything, so we have just surrendered. And do you think that Israel will stop right here? They will not by force, I mean, but politically they will still try to take much more land. And don't you think it will be hard for the people of the Gaza that once they were where they used to live, now it is territory of the Israel and they are forced to live at the corner of the state?
I'd also ask that if certain themes have already been gone over, so we can have a richer conversation if we ask different questions. Ye piche bhaiyon, idhar, excuse me, ye zara, idhar zara come please. Ji, please continue. Okay.
Thank you. So the first question was about bone of contention being territory. One of the ways to think about Israel and Palestine is one land and two peoples. And I always say that when God is your real estate agent, it's very difficult to negotiate over that territory. That mindset of God being my real estate agent and me being the chosen people, that needs to change. And in the same way that Zionism has been transformed over the last 150 years, that idea will prove untenable in the long run, of God being my real estate agent. So yes, it did start over territory, but it developed multiple other related dimensions of denying the identity of the other. So the whole problem started with one land and two people, but in the process, these two people denied the right of the other to exist. So from a Palestinian perspective, Israelis are some figment of European imagination and European creation. And from Israeli perspective, there's no such thing as Palestine. These were some Ottoman subjects that somehow ended up there. And as you hear repeatedly in Israel, they're cancer that need to be excised. That mindset hasn't worked. That has gotten us to where we are. And it's time for us to think about alternatives. So this God being the real estate agent is a very good way of looking at it. And Palestine and the cause of Palestine has been used and abused by almost all political leaders, from Gaddafi in Libya to Khomeini in Iran to everyone in between. They don't care about Palestine. They care about their own political predicament, but Palestine has become a convenient way of distracting attention from domestic shortcomings. So if you are Kurdish, if you know anything about Kurds, Kurds have a proverb. They say the Kurds have no friends except mountains, because Kurdistan is a mountainous region. Palestine doesn't even have mountains. Palestinians don't even have friends that are mountains. Yes, the West Bank is mountainous, but for all intents and purposes, Gaza is flat. And so it's Palestinians who care about Palestinians. It's not the axis of resistance. It's not the Houthis. It's not the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not Hezbollah in Lebanon. They care about their own immediate political circumstances. And so, yes, Iran did heroically, some might say, attack Israel, and the axis of resistance provided a deterrence. But ultimately, Iran's foreign policy and its security policy is motivated by Iranian national interests, not by Palestinian national interests. And we discovered this as early as 50 years ago in 1967, when we found out that Egypt didn't care about Palestine but cared about the Sinai, that Syria didn't care about Palestine but cared about the Golan Heights, that Jordan didn't care about Palestine but cared about control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And we continue to fall for the Khomeinis of the world and the Gaddafis of the world, who come and talk about liberation of Palestine for their own political purposes. Thank you. Thank you.
That this is a salient benefit of having such an erudite scholar with us. We'll take one last, well, maybe second last, well, maybe last round of questions from the gentleman there. He seems familiar.
There was a question about two-state solution.
Yes, which I think
I didn't talk about. I didn't endorse the two-state.
That's right. Go on.
Yeah, just, firstly, thank you very much, Professor and Mr. Asad, for an excellent and informative discussion. My question relates to the delicate balance between principle and pragmatism, particularly in the context of this Trump peace plan. Now, on the one hand, I think to myself, it opens the doors for a possible lasting and enduring peace. On the other hand, it also opens the doors for a war criminal by the name of Tony Blair to be at the helm of affairs. On one hand, it makes the bomb stop dropping. On the other, it does so on terms that seem, I think we could agree, far from ideal. And I also think to myself, would Ukraine ever be expected to cede so much that on principle it deserves in the face of an aggressor and a genocidal occupier in the interest of pragmatism? Now, of course, we can accept the reality that Palestinians are treated differently for whatever reason. But to what extent should they comply with this asymmetry? Should we address it? Should we just deal with the world as it is? How do you deal with the philosophical implications of this?
Over there, idhar bhi zara mic de dein.
First of all, thank you, sir, for your worthy words. My question is that recently, Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, during his speech at United Nations, showed Greater Israel map, in which many of the Arab countries were included. So why was Israel not condemned by United Nations members, and what is the reason behind Greater Israel?
And over there, in front of him.
Hello, thank you so much for this conversation. In an age where people are skipping the topic of Palestine in the fear of losing PR and losing support and losing funds, it is brave to have this conversation. My question is from Professor, that there is a rise of in the global politics, there is a rise of far right. So the far right have some contradiction. They are, of course, they are anti-immigrant, they are anti-Muslims, they are the Islamophobes. But at the same time, they say that the nation is their priority. Their internal politics is their priority. So will Israel continue to be the blue-eyed of the Western far right, as in the case of Donald Trump or in Germany or elsewhere? And my second question is,
So that's, we're running out of time. Sorry about that.
How has the fall of Assad regime and the Irani attacks
Assad
on
of
Iran
Syria,
have
how does
reduced
the fall
stake?
impact things? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Very quickly. It's a sad day when Tony Blair has become kind of the hope of many,
That's right.
many people. Anyone who's aware of Tony Blair and his time in office and his penchant for getting rich in Dubai, now we see him as the hope of future. Look, the first question was, how do we deal with kind of principle and pragmatism? Politicians can do what they want, but I think my hope is with the Palestinian person who lives in Ramallah.
Yes.
Thank you. My hope is not with Tony Blair or Donald Trump or Netanyahu or even Mahmoud Abbas. My hope is with the Palestinian in Bethlehem, in Ramallah, in Jericho, in Gaza City. Those Palestinians are the hope of the future. That generation who engages in daily resistance, those are the people who will tell us. And this whole notion of Greater Israel and the genocide is driven partly by Netanyahu's own political predicament. You know that prior to October 7, 2023, every Saturday there were mass protests in Israel, in Tel Aviv, against Netanyahu and his desire to push through judicial reforms, which would clip the wings of the Israeli Supreme Court. And Netanyahu, of course, has court cases pending against him. So his own political troubles have been driving him to the right and calling for this idea of Greater Israel and the genocide. So Netanyahu, the criminal, has now become the savior of the far right of Israel. And I think that's this idea of Greater Israel is being driven by the far right. And
Assad of Syria.
Oh, Assad of Syria and the fall of Assad of Syria. The axis of resistance, as Iran had come to coordinate it, is gone. Iran saw Syria as what Khamenei used to call Iran's strategic depth.
Yes.
And they saw Syria as the primary territorial corridor whereby they could get resources and supplies to Hezbollah. Now that's all gone. And that has what Iran, therefore, is likely to do moving forward is to resort to nuclear opacity or nuclear ambiguity, whereby it will kind of appease the IAEA and it will remain in the non-proliferation agreement, but at the same time it would kind of flirt with danger on the margins as much as it can to keep the West on its toes and to use that as a source of deterrence. The Islamic Republic has been preoccupied with deterrence, and now that axis of resistance as a source of deterrence is no longer around, it is likely to engage in what might be called nuclear ambiguity.
With thanks to Mr. Yaqoob Bangash, Mr. Asad Rahim and the Indus Conclave, if we could thank Professor Mehran Kamrava for that wonderful tour de force through the question of Palestine and hope vis-a-vis the road ahead and what the future looks like despite these terrible circumstances. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.